The morning mist clung to the valley like a soft blanket as Harper Williams guided the old blue bus along the winding mountain road. At 68, she had been driving this route for nearly 15 years, her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes constantly scanning the narrow path ahead. The passengers barely noticed her anymore. She was simply part of their daily routine, as reliable as sunrise. Harper wore the same navy blue uniform every day, pressed and clean, with her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She never said much beyond good morning and have a safe day, but her presence brought comfort to the regular commuters who depended on her to get them safely to work in the neighboring town. The bus company had hired her without many questions. Her references were solid, her driving record spotless, and she had shown up for the interview exactly on time. What they didn't know, what nobody in Pine Ridge knew, was who Harper Williams really was before she became their quiet, dependable bus driver. On this particular Tuesday in late October, the weather forecast had warned of sudden fog and possible ice on the mountain passes. Harper had checked the conditions 3 times before starting her route, noting the dropping temperature and the way the clouds seemed to be gathering with unusual speed. Her first passengers of the day were the usual crowd. Margaret from the post office, heading to visit her sister. Dr. Peterson, who commuted to the regional hospital, and Jenny, a young teacher at the elementary school. They climbed aboard with their morning coffee and newspapers, settling into their familiar seats. "Looks like it might get rough up there," Dr. Peterson commented, nodding toward the mountains as he took his seat behind Harper. Harper glanced in her rearview mirror. "We'll take it slow and steady," she replied calmly. "Better to arrive late than not at all." As they climbed higher into the mountains, the fog began to thicken. Harper reduced speed, her hands relaxed but alert on the steering wheel. She had driven in far worse conditions than this, though her passengers didn't know that. She watched the road with an intensity that came from years of training most people would never understand. 20 minutes into the journey, just as they rounded a particularly sharp curve, the fog became so dense that Harper could barely see 10 feet ahead. She pulled the bus to a complete stop at a small turnout, switching on the hazard lights. "Folks, we're going to wait here for a few minutes until this clears," she announced over the intercom. "Safety first." Some passengers grumbled quietly, checking their phones for the time. They had schedules to keep, appointments to make. But Harper remained calm, her eyes fixed on the swirling gray wall outside the windshield. That's when they heard it. The screech of tires on wet asphalt, followed by the sickening sound of metal hitting metal somewhere in the fog ahead of them. Harper was out of her seat before the echo had faded. "Everyone stay in the bus," she commanded, her voice suddenly carrying an authority that made everyone freeze. "Dr. Peterson, bring your medical bag if you have it." She grabbed the emergency kit from under her seat and stepped into the fog, moving with a purpose that seemed to transform her from a simple bus driver into something else entirely. The accident scene was worse than the sounds had suggested. A sedan had slid on the wet leaves and collided with the metal guardrail, its front end crumpled against the barrier that was the only thing preventing it from sliding down the steep mountainside. Steam rose from the damaged engine, and Harper could smell the sharp scent of leaking fluid. Inside the car, she could see 2 people. A man slumped over the steering wheel and a woman in the passenger seat, both conscious but dazed. The vehicle was positioned at a dangerous angle, its rear wheels barely maintaining grip on the slick road surface. Harper approached the driver's side window, moving carefully to avoid destabilizing the car. She tapped gently on the glass. "Sir, can you hear me? I'm here to help." The man lifted his head slowly, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. "My wife," he mumbled. "Is she okay?" Harper quickly assessed the situation. The car was unstable. The road conditions were deteriorating, and they were essentially invisible to any other traffic that might come around the curve. She needed to get these people out of the vehicle before it became a more serious emergency. "Dr. Peterson," she called back toward the bus, her voice carrying clearly through the fog. "I need you here, but approach slowly from the back of the vehicle." As the doctor made his way over, Harper was already working. She tried the driver's door. It was jammed. The passenger door was partially open, but blocked by the twisted metal of the guardrail. The back doors were the only option, but getting to them meant working around the unstable rear of the car. "Sir, I need you and your wife to stay very still," Harper said through the window. "We're going to get you out, but I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say." There was something in her voice, a calm confidence that cut through the panic and confusion. The man nodded weakly. Harper moved to the back of the car, testing each step carefully. She could feel the vehicle shifting slightly under the weight distribution, but her movements were precise and calculated. Dr. Peterson reached her position, his medical bag in hand. "How bad?" he whispered. "Conscious, mobile, but the car's not stable," Harper replied quietly. "We need to get them out through the back seat. I'll stabilize the vehicle while you guide them out." Dr. Peterson looked at her with surprise. "Stabilize? How?" Harper was already positioning herself at the rear bumper, her hands finding specific points on the car's frame. "When I say go, open the back door and help them climb over the seats. I'll keep us steady." It was an unusual plan, but something about Harper's certainty made it seem not only possible, but logical. Dr. Peterson moved to the rear door. "Now," Harper said. The extraction took less than 3 minutes. Harper's positioning and balance kept the car from shifting while Dr. Peterson helped the injured couple climb over the back seats and out to safety. Her movements were so precise, so confident, that it seemed almost routine. Once the victims were clear of the vehicle, Harper quickly guided everyone back toward the bus, supporting the injured man while Dr. Peterson helped his wife. The fog was still thick, but Harper navigated through it as if she could see clearly. "Back on the bus, doctor." Peterson tended to their injuries while Harper radioed for emergency services and road maintenance. Her voice was professional and detailed, providing exact coordinates and clear descriptions of the accident scene and road conditions. Jenny, the young teacher, watched Harper closely during the rescue. There had been something different about the way she moved, the way she took command of the situation. It wasn't just quick thinking, it was training. The kind of training that came from experience most people never had. As they waited for the emergency vehicles to arrive, Jenny noticed something else. When Harper had rolled up her sleeves to help Dr. Peterson, there had been a small mark on her forearm. Not a tattoo, but a small pin or badge that had left a permanent indentation in her skin. Jenny couldn't make out what it was, but it looked official, military perhaps, or medical. The emergency crews arrived within 20 minutes, their vehicles equipped with lights that cut through the fog. Harper briefed them quickly and efficiently, her report so thorough and professional that the lead paramedic looked at her with curiosity. "You former emergency services?" he asked. Harper shook her head. "Just a bus driver," she said simply. But Jenny heard the way she said it, and she didn't believe it for a second. The fog began to clear as the morning progressed, and Harper was finally able to continue the route. The injured couple was taken to the hospital, and the damaged car was towed away. The passengers settled back into their seats, but the atmosphere on the bus had changed. "That was incredible," Margaret from the post office said. "Harper, where did you learn to do that?" Harper adjusted her rearview mirror and put the bus in gear. "You pick things up over the years," she replied quietly. Dr. Peterson was more persistent. That wasn't something you pick up, he said. That was training. Professional training. Harper didn't respond, focusing instead on the road ahead. The fog had lifted enough to see the valley spread out below them, the small town of Pine Ridge visible in the distance. Jenny spent the rest of the ride thinking about what she had witnessed. The way Harper had moved, the calm authority in her voice, the precise way she had handled an emergency situation. It all pointed to experience that went far beyond driving a bus. That evening, Jenny found herself at her computer, curiosity getting the better of her. She started with a simple search for Harper Williams, but found nothing unusual. Then she tried different combinations. Harper Williams bus driver, Harper Williams emergency, Harper Williams rescue. Nothing. But Jenny was persistent. She was a teacher, after all, and research was part of her skill set. She began looking at the bus company's hiring records, which were public information. Harper had been hired 15 years ago with references from a company called Mountain Transport Services. A search for Mountain Transport Services led to a dead end. The company had been dissolved years ago. But Jenny found an archived news article that mentioned the company had primarily served remote airports and industrial sites, requiring drivers with special certifications. Special certifications for what? Jenny wondered. She tried a different approach, looking up airport transportation services in the region. That led her to several articles about small regional airports, cargo services, and eventually to a 15-year-old newspaper story that made her stop breathing. The headline read, "Local Pilot Retires After 30-Year Career." The article was brief, mentioning that a commercial airline pilot had quietly retired after 3 decades of service, including several emergency landings that had saved hundreds of lives. The pilot's name wasn't mentioned. The article only referred to a veteran pilot who preferred to remain anonymous. But there was a photograph. The image was grainy and taken from a distance, showing a figure in a pilot's uniform walking away from a small airplane. The person was too far away to identify clearly, but something about the posture, the way they carried themselves, looked familiar. Jenny enlarged the photo, studying every detail. In the background, barely visible, was a sign for a company called Mountain Transport Services. Her heart began to race. The next morning, Jenny boarded the bus with new eyes. She watched Harper's hands on the steering wheel, noticed the way her eyes constantly scanned not just the road, but the sky, checking weather patterns and wind direction. She observed how Harper seemed to anticipate problems before they developed, adjusting her driving for conditions that hadn't yet become obvious to her passengers. Halfway through the route, Jenny made her decision. "Harper," she said, moving to the seat directly behind the driver. "I've been thinking about yesterday. That rescue. It was amazing." Harper's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. "Just did what needed to be done." "My grandfather was a pilot," Jenny continued, watching Harper's reaction carefully. "He used to tell me that pilots develop a certain way of looking at emergency situations. They're trained to stay calm, to assess quickly, to make decisions under pressure." Harper's grip on the steering wheel tightened almost imperceptibly. "He said you could always spot a pilot, even out of uniform," Jenny continued. "It's in the way they move, the way they think, the way they automatically take command when things go wrong." Harper was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man." "He was," Jenny replied. "He also told me that the best pilots were the ones who never bragged about their flying. They just did their job and moved on to the next flight." Harper pulled the bus into the station at Pine Ridge, completing their route. As the passengers filed out, Jenny lingered. "Harper," she said softly, "were you a pilot?" Harper turned off the engine and sat quietly for a moment. Then she looked at Jenny directly for the first time. "That was a long time ago," she said simply. Jenny felt her heart skip. How long? Harper began gathering her things, her thermos, her clipboard, the emergency radio she always carried. 30 years of commercial flying. 5,000 hours in single-engine aircraft before that. Retired 15 years ago and came here because I wanted to keep driving, just closer to the ground. The admission hung in the air between them. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? Jenny asked. Harper stood up, straightening her uniform. Because it doesn't matter anymore. I'm not a pilot now. I'm a bus driver, and I'm good at being a bus driver. Jenny watched her prepare to leave. But yesterday, when you handled that accident, that was pilot training, wasn't it? Harper paused at the front of the bus. Some things you never forget, she said. Emergency procedures, keeping calm under pressure, putting other people's safety first. Doesn't matter if you're 30,000 feet up or on a mountain road. She stepped off the bus, then turned back. Jenny, some people spend their whole lives looking for recognition. Others just want to be useful. I spent 3 decades being responsible for hundreds of lives at a time. Now I'm responsible for 12 people getting safely to work each day. The number changed, but the job is the same. That afternoon, Jenny couldn't concentrate on her lesson plans. She kept thinking about Harper's words, about the idea that real service didn't need recognition or applause. She found herself wondering how many other people in Pine Ridge had stories they never told, skills they never bragged about, pasts that would surprise everyone who thought they knew them. She decided to do more research. This time, she went to the local library and asked Mrs. Chen, the elderly librarian, about archived newspaper files. Mrs. Chen led her to a section of old microfiche records and bound newspaper volumes. What are you looking for, dear? Mrs. Chen asked. And stories about aviation, particularly commercial pilots from this region, Jenny replied. Mrs. Chen's eyebrows rose. That's oddly specific. Any particular reason? Jenny hesitated. I'm working on a project about local heroes, people who've made a difference but don't get much recognition. Mrs. Chen smiled. Oh, I like that idea. Let me help you. They spent 2 hours going through old records. Mrs. Chen was surprisingly knowledgeable about aviation history, mentioning several small airports that had operated in the region over the decades. There was one story, Mrs. Chen said, pulling out a bound volume from 1994. A commercial pilot, I think it was a woman, who made an emergency landing during a severe storm. Saved everyone on board, but she never gave interviews or took credit. Jenny's pulse quickened. Do you remember any details? Mrs. Chen flipped through pages. Here it is. She pointed to a small article buried on page 6. Flight 447, emergency landing at Riverside Airport during severe weather. All 89 passengers and crew survived thanks to the skill of the pilot who was not identified in this report. Jenny read the article carefully. Flight 447 had encountered unexpected severe turbulence and instrument failure during what should have been a routine flight. The pilot had managed to land the aircraft safely at a small regional airport, despite near-zero visibility and crosswinds that were beyond normal safety limits. The article mentions that the pilot refused all interview requests, Mrs. Chen noted, said the crew was just doing their job. Jenny found 3 more similar stories over the next hour. Emergency landings, mechanical failures, severe weather incidents, all handled by pilots who seemed to prefer anonymity to recognition. None of the articles named the pilots involved, but there was a pattern of quiet professionalism that reminded Jenny strongly of Harper's demeanor. The final article was different. It was from 15 years ago, much longer than the others, and it carried a headline that made Jenny's breath catch. Veteran pilot retires after heroic career. This article had more details. It described a commercial airline pilot with 30 years of experience who had been involved in 11 emergency situations, each time bringing the aircraft and all passengers safely to the ground. The pilot had accumulated over 20,000 flight hours, earned numerous safety commendations, and had been instrumental in developing new emergency procedures that were now standard throughout the industry. But again, no name. The article did mention that the pilot had chosen to retire quietly, taking a position with a ground transportation company to stay connected to the business of getting people safely from one place to another. Jenny sat back in her chair, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "Mrs. Chen," she said carefully, "do you happen to remember when mountain transport services started operating in this area?" Mrs. Chen thought for a moment. "Oh my, that takes me back. Mountain Transport was the company that provided shuttle services to the small airports. They hired drivers with special training, people who understood aviation schedules and emergency procedures. I believe they started about 15 years ago." "And when did they stop operating?" "Oh, they didn't really stop. They just changed names when the new bus company took over the routes. Most of the drivers stayed on, including—" Mrs. Chen paused, a look of realization crossing her face. "Including Harper Williams," Jenny finished. Mrs. Chen looked at her with new interest. "Jenny, what exactly are you working on?" Jenny closed the newspaper volume carefully. "I think I'm learning that some of the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight." The next morning, Jenny boarded the bus with a different perspective. She watched Harper perform her pre-trip inspection, noting the thoroughness and precision that went far beyond what was required for a simple bus route. She observed the way Harper checked weather conditions, adjusted her route timing based on visibility, and maintained constant awareness of her passengers' safety. Dr. Peterson was on the bus again, and about halfway through the route, he moved up to sit near the front. "Harper," he said, "I've been thinking about Tuesday. That rescue operation. You handled it like you'd done similar things before." Harper kept her eyes on the road. "Experience helps in any emergency." "What kind of experience?" Dr. Peterson pressed gently. Harper was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The kind that teaches you that every decision you make affects other people's lives." Dr. Peterson nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds like medical training, or military, or ... Aviation," Harper said quietly. The bus went silent except for the hum of the engine. Several passengers leaned forward, suddenly paying attention to a conversation they had never expected to hear. "You were a pilot," Dr. Peterson said. It wasn't a question. Harper pulled the bus over at a scenic overlook, one of the regular stops on the route. She turned off the engine and turned to face her passengers. "I flew commercial aircraft for 30 years, she said simply. "Retired 15 years ago and came here because I wanted to keep working, keep being useful, but with my feet on the ground." Margaret from the post office was the first to speak. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Harper smiled slightly. "Because it doesn't change anything about this job. You don't need to know I used to fly 747s to trust me to drive you safely down the mountain. The skills transfer, but the work is the same. Getting people where they need to go without incident." Jenny found her voice. "But Harper, you've saved lives. Not just Tuesday, but before, during your flying career. Don't you think people should know?" Harper restarted the bus and pulled back onto the road. "Jenny, every person who does their job well saves lives in some way. Dr. Peterson saves lives in the hospital. Margaret makes sure important mail gets delivered, which can be life-changing for people. You teach children, which shapes their entire futures. I used to move people through the sky. Now I move them along mountain roads. The location changed, but the responsibility didn't." Dr. Peterson shook his head. "It's not the same thing, Harper. What you did on Tuesday, The way you handled that accident. That was advanced training. Professional emergency response. Yes, Harper agreed. And I use that training every day driving this bus. Every time I check weather conditions. Every time I adjust for road hazards. Every time I position the bus to maximize passenger safety. The training doesn't stop being useful just because the situation is different. The conversation continued for the rest of the route, with passengers asking questions about flying, about emergencies, about the difference between aviation and ground transportation. Harper answered thoughtfully, but always brought the focus back to the present, to the job she was doing now. As they reached Pine Ridge, Jenny made a decision. Harper, she said, would you be willing to speak to my students? Not about flying specifically, but about service, about doing important work without needing recognition for it. Harper considered this. What would you want me to tell them? The truth, Jenny replied, that heroes don't always wear uniforms or get medals. Sometimes they just show up every day and do their jobs well. Harper nodded slowly. I could do that. Word spread through Pine Ridge faster than Jenny had expected. By the end of the week, she had requests from not just her own students, but from the high school, the community center, and even the regional hospital where Dr. Peterson worked. Harper agreed to speak, but on one condition. The focus would be on the importance of everyday service, not on her aviation career. The first presentation was to Jenny's 5th grade class. Harper wore her regular bus driver uniform and brought a simple slide presentation about transportation safety and the jobs that keep communities running. Every job that serves other people is important, she told the children. The person who fixes your electricity, the person who delivers your mail, the person who teaches you math. We're all part of keeping the community working. A student raised her hand. But Miss Harper, Jenny's teacher told us you used to fly airplanes. Isn't that more important than driving a bus? Harper smiled. Flying airplanes was my job for 30 years. Driving the bus is my job now. Both jobs involve getting people safely from one place to another. The skills I learned flying help me be a better bus driver, and the responsibility is the same. Another student asked, Did you ever crash? No, Harper replied. But I had 11 emergency situations where we had to land at airports that weren't our planned destination. Each time my job was to keep everyone calm and get them safely on the ground. Were you scared? Harper thought about this carefully. Being scared is normal when something unexpected happens. But fear can't be in charge. Training has to be in charge. Practice has to be in charge. Your responsibility to other people has to be in charge. How do you not let fear be in charge? You practice until you know what to do without thinking about it. You focus on helping others instead of worrying about yourself. And you remember that your job is to solve the problem, not to be afraid of it. The presentation lasted 45 minutes, but the questions continued for another hour. The children were fascinated not just by the flying stories, but by Harper's calm, practical approach to challenge and responsibility. When Jenny walked Harper back to the bus afterward, she was quiet. Regrets? Harper asked. About what? About pushing me to talk about the flying. About bringing attention to something I've kept private for 15 years. Jenny considered this. Do you have regrets? Harper climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. No, she said. Those children needed to hear that heroism isn't about the size of your job or how much recognition you get. It's about showing up and doing the work, whatever that work is. The second presentation was to the high school, and it drew a larger audience. Parents, community members, and local officials filled the auditorium. Harper had prepared the same basic presentation, but the questions were more sophisticated. Ms. Williams, asked a senior who planned to join the military. What's the most important thing you learned from aviation that applies to everyday life? Harper thought for a moment. Checklist discipline, she said. In aviation, you never skip steps. You never assume everything is working correctly. And you never proceed until you've verified that all systems are functioning. That applies to any job where other people depend on you. A parent asked, "What made you transition from flying to bus driving? Wasn't that a step down?" Harper shook her head. Service is service. The number of people you're responsible for doesn't determine the importance of the work. When I was flying, I might have 200 passengers. Now I have 12 regular passengers who depend on me to get to work safely every day. Each of those people matters just as much as the passengers I used to fly. But surely the pay difference, the parent began. Harper cut him off gently. I didn't choose this job for the money. I chose it because I wanted to keep being useful. I wanted to use my skills in a way that served my community. Money is important, but it's not the most important thing. Dr. Peterson, who had attended the presentation, asked a question that made the auditorium go silent. Harper, in your aviation career, how many lives would you estimate you saved through emergency procedures? Harper was quiet for a long time. I never counted, she said finally. That's not how you think about it when you're doing the job. You don't think about saving lives. You think about solving problems. You think about following procedures. You think about getting everyone safely to the ground. But looking back now, Harper sighed. 11 emergency landings, an average of maybe 150 people per flight. So perhaps 1,650 people who went home to their families instead of... She trailed off. The auditorium was completely silent. Harper continued. But that's also 30 years of routine flights. Thousands of flights where nothing went wrong, where my job was simply to provide safe, reliable transportation. The emergency landings get attention, but most of the work was just doing the job correctly, day after day. After the presentation, Harper was approached by several people. A young woman studying to be a nurse thanked her for emphasizing that all service work was valuable. A retired teacher said Harper's message about consistency and reliability resonated with her own career experience. But the conversation that surprised Harper came from an elderly man who had waited until most of the crowd had left. Ms. Williams, he said, my name is Robert Martinez. I was a passenger on Flight 447 in 1994. Harper froze. I've wondered for 29 years who was flying that plane, he continued. We hit that storm system about an hour out of Denver. The turbulence was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Then the instruments started failing. Harper nodded slowly. I remember that flight. The landing at Riverside was the most terrifying and impressive thing I've ever witnessed, Martinez said. You brought us down in crosswinds that should have been impossible. Zero visibility. Emergency vehicles waiting because they were sure we weren't going to make it. We made it, Harper said simply. Because of you, Martinez insisted. And then afterward, when the reporters wanted to interview the pilot, you just disappeared. No one could find you to thank you. Harper looked uncomfortable. The whole crew did their jobs that day. I just happened to be the one holding the controls. Martinez shook his head. I've flown hundreds of times since then. I became a pilot myself, actually, partly because of that experience. I wanted to understand what you did that day. And I can tell you that what you did was extraordinary. Harper was quiet for a moment. Mr. Martinez, what do you do for work now? I'm retired, but I was an air traffic controller for 35 years. Then you know that extraordinary situations require ordinary procedures executed perfectly. That's all that happened that day. Martinez smiled. Ms. Williams, I've guided thousands of aircraft through emergency situations. I know the difference between ordinary procedures and exceptional skill. What you did that day saved 89 lives through pilot ability that goes far beyond normal training. Harper nodded. And for the last 15 years, I've been driving a bus route that gets 12 people safely to work each day. Both jobs matter. Both require the same commitment to other people's safety. Why did you retire from flying? Martinez asked. Harper considered her answer carefully. Because 30 years was enough. I had done what I set out to do. I had served well, and it was time to serve differently. Don't you miss it? The flying? Harper looked out the auditorium window toward the mountains. I miss the responsibility, she said. But I still have responsibility. Just different responsibility. Martinez extended his hand. Ms. Williams, it's an honor to finally meet you, and to thank you, 29 years late. Harper shook his hand. Mr. Martinez, it's good to know that Flight 447 led to another pilot. That's probably the best outcome that could have come from that day. Word of Harper's presentations spread beyond Pine Ridge. Jenny received calls from schools in neighboring towns, asking if Harper would be willing to speak to their students. A regional veterans organization invited her to address their annual conference. The state transportation department asked if she would consider consulting on emergency response training for public transit drivers. Harper accepted some invitations and declined others, always choosing based on whether she felt she could provide genuine value rather than simply tell interesting stories. One invitation surprised her. The Federal Aviation Administration contacted her through the school district, asking if she would be willing to participate in a panel discussion on aviation safety and emergency procedures. The panel would be part of a national conference on transportation safety. Harper initially declined, but Jenny convinced her to reconsider. Harper, Jenny said, this isn't about recognition or fame. This is about using your experience to make transportation safer for everyone. Isn't that exactly the kind of service you've always believed in? Harper thought about this for several days. Finally, she agreed, but with conditions. She would participate in the technical discussions about emergency procedures, but she wouldn't give interviews or participate in any publicity around the conference. The FAA panel took place in Denver, and Harper found herself in a room with current airline pilots, safety engineers, and federal regulators. The discussion focused on lessons learned from emergency situations and how those lessons could be incorporated into standard training procedures. Harper's contributions were technical and practical. She described decision-making processes during instrument failures, communication protocols when standard procedures don't apply, and the importance of crew coordination during high-stress situations. But what impressed the other panelists wasn't just her technical knowledge, it was her perspective on the relationship between individual skill and systematic safety. The goal isn't to create pilots who can handle any emergency, Harper said during one discussion. The goal is to create systems where emergencies are less likely to occur, and when they do occur, the response is predictable and effective. A current airline pilot asked, "How do you maintain skills and readiness during routine operations?" "Most flights don't have emergencies," Harper smiled. "Every flight is practice for the emergency that might never come. Every normal landing is preparation for the abnormal landing you hope you'll never need. You treat routine operations as training, not as downtime." An FAA safety engineer asked about the transition from military to commercial aviation, and Harper had to explain that her background was entirely civilian. "I learned to fly in small aircraft," she said. "Private instruction, then commercial certification. My first airline job was with a regional carrier flying 19 passenger planes. I worked my way up to larger aircraft over several years." "No military background?" the engineer asked, surprised. "None." Harper confirmed. Just civilian training and 30 years of experience. This seemed to surprise several panel members who had assumed that her emergency response skills came from military training. How did you develop such strong emergency procedures without military background? Asked a retired Air Force pilot who was also on the panel. Harper thought about this. I think it came from understanding that other people's lives depended on my decisions. That responsibility makes you very careful about training, very serious about preparation, and very committed to doing things correctly, even when no one is watching. The panel discussion lasted 3 hours, and Harper found herself energized by the technical conversations in a way she hadn't experienced in years. These were her people, professionals who understood the weight of responsibility that came with other people's safety. Afterward, several panelists approached her with questions and comments. The retired Air Force pilot, Colonel Sarah Jenkins, was particularly interested in Harper's perspective. Harper, she said, I've been flying for 40 years, and I've never heard emergency procedures explained quite the way you explain them. There's something different about your approach. Different how? Harper asked. You talk about emergencies as normal parts of the job rather than extraordinary events. Most pilots think of emergencies as exceptions to normal operations. You seem to think of them as part of normal operations. Harper nodded. Because they are. If you fly long enough, you will have emergency situations. If you drive long enough, you will encounter accident scenes. If you work with people long enough, you will face crisis situations. Emergency response isn't extraordinary. It's just part of doing the job well. Colonel Jenkins smiled. That's exactly what I mean. You've normalized excellence in a way that makes it seem routine instead of heroic. Because it should be routine, Harper replied. Heroism is what happens when normal systems fail and someone has to improvise. Excellence is what prevents those failures from happening in the first place. The conversation continued over dinner, with Harper finding herself in discussions about training philosophy, safety culture, and the psychology of emergency response. For the first time in 15 years, she was talking with people who shared her professional background and understood the technical aspects of her experience. On the flight back to Denver, Harper had driven to the conference. She reflected on the day. The technical discussions had reminded her how much she valued the intellectual challenges of aviation, but they had also confirmed her decision to retire when she did. Flying had been her career for 30 years, but it wasn't her identity. Her identity was about service, about responsibility, about using whatever skills she had to contribute to the safety and well-being of others. The airplane had been her tool for 30 years. The bus was her tool now. Both were just ways of doing the work that mattered. When Harper returned to Pine Ridge, she found that news of her FAA panel participation had somehow reached the local community. She wasn't sure how. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone except Jenny, but people seemed to know. Dr. Peterson was the first to bring it up. Harper, I heard you spoke at an aviation safety conference in Denver. How was that? Harper focused on the road ahead. It was Harper focused on the road ahead. It was good to talk with other professionals about safety procedures. Always something to learn. Must have felt good to be back in that world, Dr. Peterson said. Harper considered this. It felt familiar. But this is my world now. The principles are the same. Keeping people safe, being prepared for problems, doing the job right every time. Margaret from the post office leaned forward from her usual seat. Harper, don't you ever want to go back to flying? It must be more exciting than driving this old bus. Harper smiled in the rearview mirror. Margaret, excitement isn't always a good thing when you're responsible for other people's safety. The best flights were the boring ones where everything went according to plan. But surely you miss the adventure of it, Margaret pressed. I find adventure in getting all of you safely down this mountain road every day, Harper replied. Weather changes, road conditions change, traffic patterns change. Every trip requires attention and skill. It's just a different kind of flying. Jenny, who had been listening quietly, asked, Harper, what did the other pilots think about your transition to bus driving? Were they surprised? Harper was quiet for a moment. Some were, but the ones who understood service, they got it. They understood that the work matters more than the workplace. The conversation reminded Harper of something that had been bothering her since the Denver conference. Several of the panelists had asked for her contact information, wanting to continue discussions about training methods and safety culture. A few had even suggested she consider consulting work with airlines or training facilities. She had given them her information, but hadn't committed to anything. The truth was, she wasn't sure she wanted to go back to that world, even in a consulting capacity. That evening, Harper sat in her small apartment above the hardware store, looking through materials the FAA had given her about current safety training programs. The technical content was fascinating, and she could see ways that her experience might contribute to improved training methods. But she could also see how easy it would be to get pulled back into the aviation world, to let her past define her present in ways she had carefully avoided for 15 years. Her phone rang. It was Jenny. Harper, I hope I'm not calling too late. I wanted to ask you something. What's on your mind? The school district has been talking about your presentations, and they want to know if you'd be interested in developing a regular program. Not just one-time talks, but maybe a monthly series about different kinds of community service. What do you think? Harper walked to her window, which looked out over the main street of Pine Ridge. The town was quiet at this hour, streetlights casting soft circles on the empty sidewalks. What would that involve? She asked. We're thinking about bringing in different community workers each month. Firefighters, postal workers, utility workers, medical staff. People who keep the community running but don't always get recognized for it. You could coordinate the program, maybe speak once or twice a year yourself. Harper liked this idea. It would focus on the work, not the workers. Exactly. The message would be that every job that serves others is important and requires skill and dedication. I'd be interested in that, Harper said, but I'd want to make sure it doesn't become about celebrating heroes. It should be about understanding the work. That's exactly what we want, Jenny assured her. Harper, you've changed how people in this town think about service and recognition. We want to build on that. Over the following weeks, Harper worked with Jenny and the school district to develop what they called the Community Service Education Program. The idea was simple. Each month, students would learn about a different essential job in their community, meet the people who did that work, and understand how those jobs contributed to everyone's safety and well-being. The first presentation featured the volunteer fire department. Chief Rodriguez brought a truck to the school and talked about fire prevention, emergency response, and the training required to be a firefighter. Every call we respond to is someone's worst day, he told the students. Our job is to make that day a little better, to solve problems and help people when they need it most. A student asked, Are you scared when you go into burning buildings? Chief Rodriguez looked at Harper, who was helping coordinate the presentation. Ms. Williams taught me something about fear. She said fear can't be in charge. Training has to be in charge. So yes, sometimes I'm scared. But I'm more prepared than I am scared. Harper smiled. It was good to see her words being used to help other people think about their work. The second presentation featured Maria Santos, who managed the town's water treatment facility. She brought charts and water samples and explained how clean water got to everyone's homes. People turn on their faucets and expect water to come out, she told the students. My job is to make sure that happens every day, and that the water is safe to drink, It's not glamorous work, but it's essential work. A student asked, "What happens if you make a mistake?" Maria's answer was immediate. People get sick. So we don't make mistakes. We check everything twice. We follow procedures exactly, and we take responsibility for every drop of water that leaves our facility. Again, Harper heard echoes of the principles she had tried to communicate: the importance of preparation, the weight of responsibility, the pride that comes from doing essential work well. The third presentation was different. Harper had invited Robert Martinez, the air traffic controller who had been a passenger on Flight 447, to talk about his work. Martinez brought audio recordings of actual air traffic control communications and explained how controllers guide aircraft safely through complex airspace. Every pilot in the sky is depending on us to help them avoid other aircraft and get safely to their destination, he told the students. We might handle 200 aircraft in a single shift, and each one represents dozens or hundreds of people who want to get home safely. During the question period, a student asked Martinez about the scariest situation he had ever handled. Martinez looked at Harper, who was sitting in the back of the classroom. The scariest situation I was ever in wasn't one I handled professionally, he said. I was a passenger on a flight that encountered severe weather and instrument failures. But the pilot handled it so well that what could have been a disaster became just a story about professional skill and calm decision-making. He paused. That experience taught me that the best emergency response looks routine from the outside, even when it's extraordinary from the inside. After Martinez's presentation, Harper walked him to his car. "Thank you for doing this," she said. "The students needed to hear about your work." Martinez shook his head. "Harper, they need to hear about all kinds of work, but they also need to understand that some people carry responsibilities that are bigger than they appear. You've been teaching them that. I've been teaching them that all work serving others is important. Yes, but you've also been teaching them that heroism doesn't announce itself, that the most essential people are often the ones who don't seek attention." Martinez smiled. Flight 447 was 29 years ago, but I learned something that day that I've never forgotten. "What's that?" "That the difference between disaster and safety often comes down to one person who's prepared to do their job perfectly when it matters most. You were that person for 89 passengers that day, but you're still that person now, just for a smaller group." Harper considered this. "Mr. Martinez, every day, thousands of people do their jobs perfectly when it matters most. Pilots, air traffic controllers, bus drivers, teachers, firefighters. What happened on Flight 447 wasn't unique. It was just visible." "Maybe," Martinez said. "But most people never get the chance to prove what they're capable of under pressure. You've had that chance multiple times, and you've answered it every time." As Martinez drove away, Harper reflected on their conversation. She had spent 15 years trying to make her aviation career seem normal, routine, just another job. But maybe that was the wrong approach. Maybe the lesson wasn't that her flying experience was ordinary, but that extraordinary capability could be developed by anyone who took their responsibilities seriously and prepared thoroughly for the challenges they might face. That night, Harper revised her notes for the next community service education presentation, which would feature herself talking about transportation safety. Instead of downplaying her aviation background, she decided to use it as an example of how professional skills could transfer between different types of work. The transportation safety presentation was scheduled for a Friday morning, and Harper was surprised to find that the audience included not just students, but also parents, teachers, and community members. Word had spread that she would be talking more specifically about her aviation experience and how it related to her current work. Harper began with a simple question. How many of you have jobs where other people depend on you? Nearly every adult in the room raised their hand. "That's what I want to talk about today," Harper said. "The responsibility we have when other people depend on us, and how we prepare ourselves to meet that responsibility." She talked about checklists, about the importance of following procedures even when they seemed unnecessary, about staying calm under pressure, and about the way that small mistakes could have large consequences. "When I was flying commercially," she said, "I was responsible for getting passengers safely from one airport to another. Every flight required careful planning, constant attention, and readiness for problems that might never occur." She clicked to a slide showing a pre-flight checklist. "This is what pilots do before every flight. We check hundreds of items. Even on aircraft we've flown thousands of times, because we never assume that everything is working correctly." A student raised her hand. "Do you do checklists for driving the bus?" Harper smiled. "Absolutely. I check tire pressure, fluid levels, brakes, lights, emergency equipment, and communication systems before every route. The bus checklist is shorter than an airplane checklist, but the principle is the same. We never skip steps when other people's safety depends on us." She talked about the 11 emergency situations she had handled during her flying career, but she focused on the preparation and training that had made it possible to handle those situations, not on the drama of the events themselves. Emergency response looks calm from the outside because it's based on training and preparation, she explained. "We practice emergency procedures over and over so that when real emergencies happen, we don't have to think about what to do. We just do it." Dr. Peterson, who was in the audience, asked, "Harper, what's the most important thing you learned from aviation that applies to everyday life?" Harper thought carefully. "That little things matter. A small mistake in planning can become a big problem later. A small compromise in procedure can lead to a dangerous situation. Attention to detail isn't perfectionism, it's responsibility." "And what's the most important thing you've learned from driving the bus that you didn't know from flying?" This question surprised Harper. She hadn't expected to be asked about learning from her current job. "Community," she said after a moment. "When I was flying, I was responsible for passengers, but they were strangers. I saw them for a few hours, then never again. Driving the bus, I'm responsible for the same people every day. I know Margaret has arthritis and needs extra time getting up the steps. I know Dr. Peterson checks his phone for emergency calls and might need to get off at an unscheduled stop. I know Jenny grades papers on the bus and needs good lighting." She paused. "Flying taught me about technical responsibility. Bus driving has taught me about personal responsibility. Both matter." After the presentation, Harper was approached by several people, but the conversation that stayed with her came from a high school student named David. "Ms. Williams," he said, "I'm planning to join the Air Force after graduation. I want to be a pilot. Do you have any advice?" Harper studied the young man carefully. "What draws you to flying, David?" "I want to serve my country, and I want to do something important, something that matters." Harper nodded. "Those are good reasons. But David, let me ask you something. If you couldn't be a pilot, if for some reason that didn't work out, what else would you want to do?" David looked confused. "I don't know. I hadn't really thought about it." "Why?" "Because the desire to serve and do important work shouldn't depend on one specific job. If you want to serve your country and do work that matters, there are hundreds of ways to do that. Pilot training is excellent preparation for many different kinds of service." Harper handed him a business card. "This is the contact information for Colonel Sarah Jenkins, the Air Force pilot I met at the Denver conference. She coordinates recruitment and training programs. Tell her I suggested you call." David took the card eagerly. "Thank you, Ms. Williams. This means a lot." David, one more thing. Whatever you end up doing in the Air Force, remember that the most important part is doing it well, not doing it for recognition. The best pilots I've known were the ones who cared more about safely completing the mission than about being seen as heroes. That conversation reminded Harper of something she had been thinking about since the Denver conference. Several of the panelists had suggested that her perspective on training and safety culture could be valuable for developing new pilots. Maybe there was a way to contribute to aviation training without leaving her current job. That weekend, Harper called Colonel Jenkins. "Colonel, this is Harper Williams from the FAA panel in Denver. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "Harper!" "I was hoping you'd call. I've been thinking about our conversation about normalizing excellence. I'd love to continue that discussion. Actually, I'm calling about something specific. I have a high school student here who's interested in Air Force pilot training, but I also have a question about training methods." Harper explained David's situation and gave Jenkins his contact information. Then she said, "Colonel, you mentioned that you coordinate training programs. Do you ever use civilian consultants for training development?" "Frequently." "Why?" "I've been wondering if there might be ways to incorporate civilian emergency response experience into military pilot training. Not to replace military training, but to supplement it with perspectives from other transportation industries." Jenkins was immediately interested. "Harper, that's a fascinating idea. Can you give me an example?" Harper thought about her experience with the bus accident on the mountain. Bus drivers and airline pilots face different types of emergencies, but the decision-making process is similar. We both have to assess situations quickly, prioritize passenger safety, communicate clearly, and execute procedures under pressure. There might be training value in cross-pollinating those experiences. "I'd like to explore this further," Jenkins said. "Would you be interested in developing some materials or participating in training exercises?" "Possibly," Harper replied. "But I want to be clear about something. I'm not looking to return to aviation as a career. I have a job here that I value, and responsibilities to my community. Any consulting work would have to fit around that." Understood completely. Actually, that perspective might make your contribution even more valuable. You're someone who chose community service over career advancement. That's exactly the kind of mindset we want to develop in our pilots. They talked for another 30 minutes about possible collaboration. Jenkins suggested that Harper might participate in occasional training exercises, develop written materials about civilian emergency response, or consult on training curriculum development. "The key," Jenkins said, "is that this would be about sharing your perspective, not about returning to aviation." Does that interest you? Harper found that it did. "Let me think about it and talk to some people here. Can I call you back in a week?" "Absolutely. And Harper, thank you for thinking of this. We need more people who understand that service takes many forms." After hanging up, Harper sat quietly in her apartment, thinking about the direction her life had taken over the past few months. 6 months ago, she had been simply the bus driver, known for reliability, but not for her background. Now she was coordinating educational programs, consulting with federal agencies, and considering ongoing involvement in aviation training. But the core hadn't changed. She was still getting up at 5:30 every morning to drive the mountain route. She was still checking weather conditions and road hazards. She was still responsible for getting her passengers safely to their destinations. The difference was that people now understood the depth of experience she brought to that responsibility. On Monday morning, as Harper drove her regular route, she mentioned the Air Force opportunity to Dr. Peterson. "That sounds like important work," he said. "Are you going to do it?" "I'm considering it. But I want to make sure it doesn't interfere with this job. You all depend on me to be here." Margaret from the post office overheard. "Harper, we depend on you to be here, but we also want you to use your skills where they can do the most good. If you can help train military pilots, that could save lives all over the world." Jenny, who was grading papers in her usual seat, looked up. "Harper, what if you did both? What if the consulting work actually made you better at this job?" Harper hadn't considered this perspective. "How do you mean?" "Well, if you're working with current training methods and safety procedures, you might learn things that apply to bus driving too. Cross-pollination works both ways." Dr. Peterson nodded. "Jenny's right. Besides, Harper, you've shown us that service doesn't have to be either or. You can serve this community and serve the broader aviation community at the same time." That afternoon, Harper called Colonel Jenkins back. "Colonel, I'd like to explore the consulting opportunity, but with some specific parameters." "What do you have in mind?" "I could develop written materials and participate in occasional training exercises, but my primary commitment has to remain here. I drive a bus route 5 days a week, and I coordinate community education programs. Any Air Force work would have to fit around those responsibilities." "Harper, that's perfect. In fact, it makes your perspective even more valuable. You're someone who's successfully transitioned from aviation to ground transportation while maintaining the same safety standards and service commitment. That's exactly what we want to teach our pilots about career adaptability and lifelong service." They worked out an arrangement where Harper would develop training materials during her off hours and participate in training exercises during school breaks when her educational programs weren't running. The first project was to develop a written guide comparing emergency decision-making in civilian aviation, military aviation, and ground transportation. Harper found the work intellectually engaging in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Writing about the similarities and differences between piloting commercial aircraft and driving passenger buses forced her to think systematically about the skills she had developed and how they transferred between different contexts. The guide took her 3 months to complete, working mostly in the evenings and on weekends. When she submitted it to Colonel Jenkins, the response was immediate. "Harper, this is exceptional. You've identified connections between different types of transportation safety that I've never seen articulated before. We want to use this as the foundation for a new training module." The first training exercise Harper participated in was held at a Colorado Air Force base during spring break. She found herself working with young pilot trainees, discussing scenarios where standard procedures might not apply and creative problem solving was required. "The key," Harper told the trainees, "is to remember that procedures exist to help you think clearly, not to replace thinking. When you encounter a situation that doesn't fit standard procedures, you use the principles behind the procedures to develop new solutions." A young pilot asked, "How do you know when to follow procedures exactly and when to adapt them?" Harper smiled. "Experience helps, but it's not just about experience. It's about understanding the purpose of each procedure. If following a procedure exactly will achieve its purpose, you follow it exactly. If the situation requires modification to achieve the same purpose, you modify it. But you never abandon the purpose." She used the bus accident on the mountain as an example. Standard procedure would have been to call emergency services and wait for them to arrive. But the car was unstable, the victims were injured, and the weather was deteriorating. The purpose of standard procedure, getting help to injured people as quickly as possible, required me to modify the approach. The training exercise lasted 3 days, and Harper found herself energized by working with young pilots who were serious about their training and committed to excellence. But she also found herself appreciating her quiet life in Pine Ridge in a new way. The intellectual stimulation of the training work made her regular bus route seem peaceful rather than routine. When she returned to Pine Ridge, Jenny was the first to ask about the experience. "How was it working with the Air Force?" "Good," Harper replied. "Reminded me why I like driving the bus." Jenny laughed. "Really? In what way?" The pilots were impressive, skilled, dedicated, serious about their responsibilities. But they're at the beginning of their careers, full of energy and ambition. I'm at a different stage. I've had the high-pressure career. Now I value the satisfaction of doing familiar work well. "Do you think you'll continue with the consulting?" Harper considered this. "Yes, but not because I want to get back into aviation. Because the work helps me understand my own experience better, and that makes me better at everything else I do." Over the following year, Harper settled into a rhythm that balanced her various responsibilities. She drove the bus route 5 days a week, coordinated monthly community education programs, and participated in Air Force training exercises 3 times a year. Each type of work informed the others. The community education programs helped her understand how to communicate complex ideas simply. The Air Force consulting kept her current with safety procedures and training methods. The bus driving provided daily practice in the practical application of transportation safety principles. But the most important realization came from seeing how her different roles complemented each other rather than competing for her attention. One morning, as Harper completed her pre-trip inspection of the bus, she noticed Jenny watching her. "You're very thorough," Jenny observed. Harper smiled. "You can't be partially thorough. Either you check everything or you don't." "Is that something you learned from flying?" Flying, bus driving, Air Force consulting, they all teach the same lesson. Other people are depending on you to do your job correctly. That's not a burden. It's a privilege. Jenny climbed aboard and took her usual seat. "Harper, can I ask you something personal?" "Sure." "Are you happy? I mean, with this life? This combination of work?" Harper started the engine and began the familiar route down the mountain. "Jenny, I spent 30 years flying aircraft because I wanted to serve others by providing safe transportation. I've spent 15 years driving this bus for the same reason. I've spent the last year doing consulting work for the same reason." She paused to navigate a sharp curve, checking her mirrors and adjusting for the morning fog. "The work has changed, but the purpose hasn't. As long as I can use my skills to serve others, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing." Jenny smiled. "That's a good answer." "It's an honest answer," Harper replied. "And honestly, I think this combination of work is probably the best use of my experience. I get to contribute to aviation safety through the consulting, serve my immediate community through the bus route, and help young people understand the value of service through the education programs." "And you don't miss the excitement of flying?" Harper laughed softly. "Jenny, I've had enough excitement for one lifetime. These days, I prefer the satisfaction of routine excellence to the adrenaline of emergency response." As they descended through the morning mist toward Pine Ridge, Harper reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. 30 years of commercial aviation, 15 years of bus driving, and now a new chapter that honored both experiences while serving current needs. She had never set out to be anyone's idea of a hero. She had simply wanted to do work that mattered, to use her skills in service of others, and to take responsibility seriously. The recognition that had come over the past year was gratifying, but it wasn't the point. The point was the work itself, the daily practice of showing up, being prepared, and doing her job well, regardless of who was watching or what thanks she received. As they pulled into the Pine Ridge bus station, completing another safe journey down the mountain, Harper realized that this was exactly where she belonged. Not because it was easy or comfortable, but because it was useful. And in the end, being useful was all she had ever wanted to be. That afternoon, Harper received a call from a journalist who had heard about her story through the Air Force training programs. "Ms. Williams, I'd like to write an article about your transition from airline pilot to bus driver and your current consulting work. Would you be willing to be interviewed?" Harper considered the request. What would be the focus of the article? The human interest angle. How someone with your background ended up driving a bus in a small town, and what that says about service and career choices. Harper was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate the interest, but I'm not sure that's a story I want to tell." "Why not?" "Because it makes it sound like driving the bus is somehow less important than flying planes. That's not the message I want to send." The journalist pressed gently. "But surely you could use the platform to talk about the importance of all kinds of service work." Harper thought about this. "Let me suggest something different. If you want to write about service, write about all the people who keep communities running. Write about bus drivers and pilots and firefighters and teachers and postal workers. Don't make it about my transition from one job to another. Make it about the value of the work itself." "That's not really the angle I had in mind," the journalist admitted. "Then I'm probably not the right person for your story," Harper replied politely. After hanging up, Harper realized that this conversation had clarified something important for her. She was willing to share her experience when it served educational purposes or contributed to improved safety training. But she wasn't interested in personal recognition or in stories that suggested some kinds of work were more valuable than others. The work was the thing. Everything else was just distraction. As Harper prepared for her evening consulting call with Colonel Jenkins, she looked out her window at the quiet streets of Pine Ridge. Tomorrow morning, she would get up at 5:30, check the weather, inspect the bus, and drive her regular route down the mountain. Margaret would board with her weekly letters to mail, doctor. Peterson would check his phone for emergency calls, Jenny would grade papers in the back seat, and Harper would get them all safely to their destinations. It was important work. Not because it was dramatic or dangerous, but because it was necessary. Because other people depended on it. Because it served something larger than herself. And that, Harper reflected, was all any of us could really ask of our work. The chance to be useful, to serve others, and to do our jobs so well that people could depend on us. Everything else was just details. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.